This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley Ruxton by Verrill MIGHELS. Chapter 40. A Night of Toil. Alice Van Kirk on Sunday afternoon felt as if the suspense and strain of uncertainty would completely break her down. The morning had been sufficiently insupportable. She had barely slept all night, and with Stuyvesant reporting no progress after 10 o'clock, her cup of anguish had seemed full to overflowing. But the afternoon, as mockingly barren of news or hope as any hours already endured, brought calls and callers innumerable with inquiries as to Thurley's health, invitations for the week forthcoming, and astonishment and curiosity on the part of those who discovered by personal attendance at the mansion that Thurley was away. Alice had not revealed the truth to anyone save Robley and the Baron. She feared and dreaded the rumours and gossip, the exaggerated tales, and the inescapable suspicions that knowledge of the Prince's disappearance would immediately engender. Nevertheless, to maintain a smiling composure and to parry insidious queries was taxing the utmost of her ingenuity, and all but driving her distracted. Major Phipps, who had been away recuperating from his literary labours for several weeks, was one of the callers. He came with Kelsey Woods, and was annoyingly insistent in his probing as to Thurley, her whereabouts and prospects. Willie Stetson, with 20 different bunches of flowers for Thurley to accept or reject, but to exercise her wholly untrammelled choice upon, was early on the scene. Algy Dearborn brought a brand new limerick. Captain Fowler and Beau Bremer of the diplomatic service arrived almost together. Lady Honor Calthrop and Count Fieschi came together as they had on a number of occasions. Gaylord came later with floral contributions, and by great good fortune did not collide with the Count. Fieschi was sufficiently persistent in his reiterated desire to be made acquainted at once with Thurley's whereabouts. He cornered Alice by herself at the moment when the others were engaged in a mild debate on woman's suffrage, and repeated his wishes anew. "It is not that I shall be considered as one of the limpid others," he explained. "My nature is one of fire and action. So impatient to move, to surround. Miss Thurley herself understands. She would wish it for me to be informed where she is, what she does away from her home, where I shall send my eager thoughts to remind her of the pleasant times whenever we have met." "I quite understand," said Alice, distraught by her haunting fears. "If I were to tell you, Count Fieschi, that she is far away and in peril, what would your fire and action do?" He grinned. "I should be aware, dear lady, that you are a humorous people, you Americans. I shall wait. She must presently return. My longing shall bring her back." "Perhaps," said Alice, "but I would pray God to send her a humorous American man with a good strong arm and fearless heart. No hothouse absent treatment." She rose and joined the others restlessly, her feeling one of negative guilt that she talked and smiled with guests like these and did nothing at all for Thurley. She was glad when they went, particularly glad to be rid of the glib Fieschi, shamelessly boasting of the heat of his heart that she knew to be colder than brass. But if the Count was insistent, Gaylord was fairly intolerable. The man was at the brink of ruin. His nerves were as brittle as glass. He was pale, irritable, strung taut as a rope between two twisting screws. Paishe had crowded him fairly to the edge, and he felt already that the slightest push must hurl him downward to the pit. Some way in his desperate plight he felt the necessity for Thurley Ruxton, a summon of the other days, to whom to open the gates of his soul and relieve the pressure within. She had not replied to his letter, that note amounting to a curt demand that she permit him to announce their engagement. Irrationally he told himself that if she had only sent him word, definite word, even a negative reply, the entire fabric of his luck must have undergone a transformation. He was not prepared to accept her no for his answer. Today, however, it was anything to find her, and perhaps compel her to consent to be his wife. He felt it would conquer Paishe. To discover that she was absent from the scene, and to receive no adequate explanation of what her absence meant, increased his annoyance and impatience. "See here," he said to Alice in his domineering way, the moment he could snatch her away from the others, "we both understand that my position with Thurley is unlike that of anyone else. I've a right to know where she's gone." Alice was nettled. "I wish it were such a right as might keep you better informed, more vitally in touch with events, and then perhaps you might assist instead of goading me." "What do you mean?" he demanded. "You're not declaring your ignorance as to where she is." "And if I were, what then?" He narrowed his gaze upon her, countless suspicions flashing briefly in his brain. "You're sure she hasn't gone to New Haven?" he said. "It isn't some attempt to erase all final traces of the past?" Alice could almost have slapped him. "Her past with you?" she queried, as she had on previous occasions. "I am sure there is no occasion, Mr. Gaylord. If, as you say, you occupy a peculiar position with regard to Thurley, what would you think your duty should anything arise to menace her happiness, her freedom, her life?" She had masked her intensity of feeling, or, if she had not, Gaylord failed to penetrate her thin veneer of calm. He smiled again in his mirthless, sardonic manner, the manner of one desperate no matter where he turns. "Is this some trap for me?" he inquired. "Does it snap upon my answer?" "It does, to some extent, though my question was not intended as a trap." "Precisely. May I exercise the privilege of avoiding the trap?" "You may think the trap avoided." He ceased to smile. "I suppose you mean I am trapped no matter how I answer." Alice shrugged her shoulders. "Your fate is of your own making, not of mine. Suppose Thurley needed help. You claim you occupy a special position in her destiny. How far would you be willing to go? What would you sacrifice to find her and give her assistance?" Gaylord wondered if perchance the game was over and Thurley sent away, whether Alice Van Kirk had begun to fear detection of their game, and had brought it to a sudden termination. His attitude was altered by the thought, so lightly did his weather vane respond to a zephyr of change. "If she's out of town," he replied, "I'd do what I could, do anything in reason, except, of course, to leave the city just at present. God knows my whole career may depend on my being here now every minute." "Exactly," said Alice, and that was her final word with the man, but not her final disgust. She sounded nearly every man who had hung on Thurley's words and moves, while flowers and speeches were the price. There was none in them all, she felt convinced, with the manhood, the courage, and the self-denial to risk his comfort, far less risk his life, should the princess require such sacrifice to defend her, perhaps from death. In the final analysis, not a few regarded Thurley as already the prize, and therefore the charge of the young Grand Duke Karl Wilhelm. They would gladly flirt with his affianced bride, but her dangers were all for him. It was late when Stuyvesant found at last that a faint star of hope had risen. His message was brief and excited, the merest statement that a hint had arrived at the baron's headquarters, and that anything further that might develop would be phoned in later on. He was going, Robley added, to a place far out from Manhattan, to investigate a vague report that might prove utterly groundless. It was something, at least, on which to act, and midnight would tell the tale. To all of Alice's eager questions he returned the vaguest of answers, presently hanging up the phone. If disappointment lurked beyond, he preferred to accept its brunt himself and not raise beaming expectations to dash them later in the night. It was late when he started his car with his man in the driver's seat. He had ascertained that no railroad trains ran nearer than 15 miles or more to the west of North Winnig. He was dressed in furs, which differed but slightly from those of his mechanician. Wolfskin robes were heaped in the tonneau's hold, should occasion arise for their use. Their lamps were lighted on the ferry boat. Half an hour later, with nearly 4 clear hours ahead of them, in which to cover a distance calculated at something under 70 miles, the car was going like a huge projectile over roads hard as flint. The darkness descended swiftly. The night was moonless, but the film of snow that lay on all the lifeless world reflected the dim refulgence of the heavens, clearly defining the pike. For more than a quarter of the distance the big dark device of modern power and velocity shot through villages, past fields, and over bridges like a thing made glad by its own sheer might and perfection. Then it blew out a tire, and a long, heart-racking siege of disasters had been ushered in as if at the beckoning of fate. A cylinder began to miss, almost upon the resumption of the journey. For fully an hour both Stuyvesant and his man sought vainly to locate the trouble. When they came upon it finally, they found it somewhat serious, a valve rod sticking every other minute, and then for a time running normally. Filing and oiling aided materially, but the lost minutes were totaling fast. When once he could drive ahead again, the chauffeur urged such terrific speed that wreckage was constantly threatened. One violent manoeuvre resulting from this recklessness stripped out the gears of the intermediate speed. A battery connection shaken loose brought on the recurrence of the missing, for which the valve rod was for long mistakenly attacked. One crushing, delaying complication after another arose. The great machine, now racing, now barely toiling in the highway, performed every known depravity of steel and spark and gasoline. Another tire went the way of ruin. Impatiently, wildly, Stuyvesant strove to redeem lost time, but in vain. It was one interminable series of delays, repairs, and exhausting efforts to keep the machine on its legs. 8 o'clock found them far from anywhere, with 40 miles to go. Calamity overtook them almost while they reckoned that, with luck, they would still be late no more than half an hour. At 9 they were down and out again, Stuyvesant groaning in vain. He had looked at his watch 100 times, and now, with more than 30 miles to travel, was sweating in the frozen wind to think of what might be happening where Thurley waited, peering through the night for the help that could not arrive. How they limped along toward North Winnig, Robley could never have told. It seemed a veritable nightmare of helplessness, wherein he struggled furiously to get ahead, only to be baffled, hindered, stalled by things intangible that may not be engaged or overcome. It was midnight and past when they came at last to the village. They had gone astray from the road among their other accidents, and expended an hour getting back. The little settlement in which they found themselves at last seemed part of the frozen world. Not a light was shown from any house, where all appeared like spectral things, merely mockeries of men's abodes, with glassy eyes lifelessly staring. Leaving his man in charge of the car, Stuyvesant hastened off at once to find the abandoned mill. He came there at last, discovering an empty old ruin through which the wind was howling dismally. Armed as he was, he nevertheless approached it with caution, only to ascertain that a burial place would exhibit more cheer and life. He knew that if Thurley had been here at all, she had long since gone away. Bitterness and self-accusation and impotent bickerings at fates and accidents consumed him there in the wind. It seemed so utterly puerile to have come this far and be obliged to turn about and return, the way he had travelled, crowned with defeat and disappointment. There was nothing about the structure to give him the slightest guidance or hint as to what he should do. He could only turn disgustedly away, reviling himself for failure in Thurley's hour of need, and face the cold and desolation between himself and his car. Harassed, even tortured by worry and apprehension as to what his delinquency might have involved, he could only wonder vaguely how possible to serve the princess now. He could think of one thing only: remain for the night at North Winnig, and by search and inquiry early in the morning redeem a little of his effort. He came to the village street some distance from his car. Up the road he went as rapidly as possible, wondering soon if his man had curled himself down in the furze to keep himself warm as he waited. He had rather expected the man to be walking about on the road, warming himself by motion. "Banks," he called as he came in speaking distance, but no reply was returned. He came to the car, glanced in at the tonneau, discovered it empty of anything save the furs, and was passing along the front of the hood when he all but fell over his man. He was lying loosely crumpled in the road, his hat a little thrown aside, his face marble white on the snow. "Banks!" cried Stuyvesant, kneeling down, but the man, unconscious, left there for dead by Pelavin and Max, returning from their long cold wait at the mill, neither heard nor felt nor moved. End of chapter 40. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley Ruxton by Verrill MIGHELS. Chapter 41. The Gold of Morning. It was not till an hour afterward, with the village astir and the neighbourhood agog, that Stuyvesant paused for a moment to wonder why his chauffeur had been attacked. He was unaware that Banks, in the night's dim starlight, resembled the Grand Duke Karl somewhat strikingly. The task of dragging and carrying Banks to a house, arousing the inmates, and inducing the frightened men and hysterical women of the immediate vicinity to help him save his mechanician's life, had occupied all his strength and thought. Underlying all of this was a dull but throbbing consciousness that Thurley was somewhere near or far, disappointed if alive, and doubtless in the hands of assassins allied with those who must have beaten Banks. It was never possible for even the part of a second to forget that the princess had called him, sent him her brief appeal, expected him here or somewhere at the fateful hour of 9. He felt that now, in the hours left of the long, disastrous night, he should be in his car, driving hither and yon, moving, doing something definite, something to find her and help her. He groaned at the necessity of serving Banks while neglecting Thurley, though the loyal impulse of his nature urged him readily to give all he could to his man. Banks had sustained a frightful blow on the skull. That the arch of bone had not been more severely fractured or even crumpled inward was a miracle, due perhaps to the thickness of his hair. He had not revived till nearly 3 in the morning, and then for a moment only. A local physician, summoned tardily, had exhausted himself and his resources early, while the ministrations of the women served to better purpose. It was daylight, and Stuyvesant was still tirelessly assisting and directing operations, when his man at length gave assurance of assuming his normal functioning, so suddenly interrupted, and so near its termination. The man, however, would be too ill and weak to be moved for several days. The name of a skilful woman, nurse, was supplied in answer to Stuyvesant's demands. She lived in a larger village 20 miles away, whither no one could go in a hurry. There was no alternative, as Robley knew. He must go in his car and drive the machine himself. He drank 3 steaming cups of coffee, thoughtfully provided by the one calm woman of the house, and started on his way. The sun arose in clouds and blew together its first frost, brightened rays appearing to press upon the earth a colder wave of air. Far off, on a lonesome snow-strewn road, Thurley had meantime roused from an inactivity which could scarcely be described as sleep. She had shivered and chattered all night in her box, drawing shavings and her tattered cloak about her chilling limbs and shoulders, and had risen at times to beat her hands, tramp up and down the shop, and otherwise struggle with the numbing cold that crept to the marrow of her bones. The first faint streaks of dawn had readily addressed her senses, alert for signs that the night was past, since its darkness and drag had seemed to be centuries long. She had slipped from the shed-like structure only to find the half-dim world a scene of chill and desolation. The wind had sought her instantly, as if in greed for a victim long denied. To face the road thus early was utterly disheartening. She was not even sure of the way she had come. Back to the darkness of the partly sheltered shop she hastened, to hunt in vain for a match whereby a fire might be lighted in the forge. When at last the sun put a finger through a crack, a slender golden finger, cold but comforting, smouldering hope took flame again in the heart of the weary girl. Her courage was endless. She felt that if only she could find a house with any sort of welcome in a space of 20 miles, she would walk and make no complaint. No sooner had she issued forth, however, and ascertained her right direction by sight of the fire-ruined house, than all the old fears of the previous night, plus 100 more, returned to reignite her fever. The darkness, after all, had been her friend. By the morning's light those terrible men and the frightful woman at the house she had quitted would soon be infesting every road. They could not long remain in ignorance of her escape, if they had not indeed discovered her absence early in the night. It seemed almost as if perhaps her greater safety lay in remaining at the shop. Yet there they might also presently search, and there she could starve or perish with cold, before she might perchance be enabled to hail some passing vehicle and beg for aid and protection. And how should she know from whom to implore assistance, since of all the men she had heard at the house she had seen but one, Pellivan? She knew she must simply hasten on as fast as stiffened, aching limbs could carry her down the road. If only the chain about her waist could be dropped, she should feel such tremendous relief. She was powerless, however, to remove it, and breathlessly expectant that any moment she might be startled by a shout as pursuing men espied and bore down upon her, she faced the bleakness of the lifeless road and trudged bravely onward as before. She had certainly gone far less than a mile, and was coming to a wooden bridge that spanned a black little stream, when out of the crispness of the morning air came a series of sharp percussions. She knew them at once, the rapid-fire discharges of a motor car with the muffler cut out open. Her heart leaped like a doe discovered by a hunter. The car was somewhere down ahead, but was not in sight where the road curved in the woods. Instinctively certain that pursuit alone could arouse men at sunrise, she darted swiftly to the bridge, leaped down a frozen bank of gravel, and was presently crouching in the shadows by the stream, holding her breath to still her heart, which she felt must betray her with its beating. She had not long to wait. The car, thus early disturbing the silence, sped with a snarl of power to the bridge and over its planks, rattling down dust and bits of snow on the girl as grey as her cloak. It was gone as quickly, its two eager occupants, Max and Jan, wildly searching the road, copse and field as they rounded the circle back to the house from which their intended victim had escaped. They had made their discovery shortly after 2 in the morning, returning from their wait at the mill and their murderous assault made upon Banks, who had been discovered too late to be another person than the young Grand Duke. They had striven in vain to arouse Zagorski, till the door had been forced and the truth abruptly discovered. At daylight the search on foot had begun, then the car brought into requisition. They had taken a road where some tracks in the snow had been left undisturbed by the wind. The tracks were not Thurley's. Now their circle brought them back again, calculations convincing both the men that their captive could scarcely have gone so far, even by walking all night. When they came to the old-time blacksmith shop, they halted and broke in the door. Thurley, meantime, not having dared attempt to look when the car was passing, remained in her place of concealment till the faintest sound had died away in the distance. When she emerged to clamber once more to the frozen road and hasten on more feverishly than before, she was suddenly afflicted by a second thought which made her sick with disappointment. It might have been Robley in his car from whom she had hidden at the bridge. He might have received her note at last and have come as soon as possible, arriving only at dawn. It was highly improbable, after all, that creatures such as she had seen at the house of her imprisonment would employ an automobile. She could almost have cried, she could almost have turned and run where the car had disappeared, but the thought of proceeding in that direction was instantly frightening. She could only plod ahead. How far she had trudged when once again she heard the lively puncturing of the air by a motor's exhaust, Thurley neither knew nor cared. She was once more possessed by alarms and excitements, the instincts of precaution, the hope of deliverance and friends. The car she heard was behind her. It was not yet to be seen, so winding was the road. She had halted opposite a more than usually desolate area where trees had been cut, earth hauled away, and stumps left strewn in dismal neglect. She darted to the cover that the nearest one afforded, and concealed herself behind its blackened bulk. The car was coming rapidly, still hidden by the earthy bank where excavations had ceased. It slowed to take a furrowed bit of road, its muffler purring quietly, then rolled into view with the sunlight gleaming from its brass. "Robley!" cried Thurley, leaping to her feet and stumbling and pitching grotesquely to catch her balance where a frozen clod had caught her foot. She saw the startled, whitened face of Stuyvesant turned upon her, and felt as if her very soul must leap from her bosom in joy. He had halted his car as if it had struck a wall. He leaped from his seat, and as he had that day when he fell, and ran to catch her in his arms as she lunged once more to fall from weakness and the stiffness of her body. "Thurley," he said, "Thurley, in God's name, how? Oh, get me away! Don't stop!" she interrupted wildly, clinging to him helplessly. "I've walked so far, and they may be coming any minute. Oh, you've come. I don't see how you could have ever found me, but please don't wait, don't talk, let's go, just as fast as ever we can." "But Thurley, let me help you in," he said to her, leading her promptly round the car, where she climbed to the seat beside his own. "There's no one on the road. You're cold. Good heavens, what you must have been through! You must take these robes. Perhaps you'd better ride in the back. Which way do you wish me to go?" So many words, explanations, and questions were on his mind that he abandoned coherence in despair, and thoroughly weakened by sudden relief and reliance on his strength, could only sink in the cushioned seat, muffled with furs, and reply in broken sentences. "I'd rather ride here. Oh, to see you, anyone, after it all, the horrible dream. But they'll come, just straight ahead, anywhere but back the other way, somewhere to get a train or reach a house and demand protection. They'd stop at nothing now. Just please make it go." The car started slowly down the road. "You're safe," he assured her, gaining in calm as her weakness increased upon her and the need for his strength arose. "You're excited, Thurley, naturally. God, to think—" "What's that?" she interrupted wildly, her eyes tremendously dilated and blazing in his own. "What's what? It's another car. Oh, if it should be!" She had turned to look backwards on the highway. Suddenly round the turn shot a big red limousine, 2 men on the seat in front. One of the men half rose by the wheel and let out a yell like a fiend. Stuyvesant's car had already responded to his urging of spark and throttle. He felt thoroughly slump in sickening fear, and understood the situation as no spoken word could have told him. He crowded on his utmost power. The monster beneath him lurched forward like a liberated locomotive, and a furious race began. End of chapter 41. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley Ruxton by Verrill MIGHELS. Chapter 42. The Race. There was certainly less than 300 yards between the cars when Jan and Max, who had turned 5 miles back on suspicion to pursue the Stuyvesant machine, were obliged to slow for the briefest period where the ruts would have wrecked their motor. Stuyvesant, glancing back at them quickly, was confident of winning should his car behave its best, but his face was grim. "These men have no right, wouldn't dare," he started to cry, but he realized they would halt at nothing as a vivid conviction was flashed on his brain that doubtless they had struck the blow that had all but killed his man. "We're gaining," cried Thurley, her strength and courage reasserting themselves with wonderful resilience. "Can you give her any more?" For his answer, Stuyvesant jammed the muffler cutout with his heel. A terrific series of detonations instantly followed. The car plunged forward with newer zest, and trees shot past in a blur. In the moment's advantage caused by the ruts that held the pursuing monster at the rear, they nearly doubled their lead. Then on came the giant limousine, like the fragment of a meteor ripping up the road. It was Jan driving, his rage prodigious. his lust for murder now a mania broken from its bounds. The car was one of enormous power, a racing model, equipped with the limousine for winter use, but little hindered by this bulky superstructure. Its 6 big cylinders were pouring might and Gatling fusillade upon the road. It roared like an engine of doom and destruction, hurtling and rocketing to overtake the fleeing machine ahead. Stuyvesant's car was low to the ground like a greyhound eager for work. For some inexplicable reason, the motor that had balked in the night was running like a dream, its mighty pistons hurtling a cataract of power upon the shaft and wheels. Despite the superior dynamic of the car behind, it continued to creep away. Snow, frozen dust, and a stifling cloud of fumes seemed scorched from Stuyvesant's path when he leaned a little forward and gave more oil to the swiftly heating motor. Din, crazy speed, and appalling velocity marked the course where the huge devices raced. A knife-edge wind seemed hurtling down upon Thurley as they split the frozen air. The road became a torrent, rushing incredibly under their wheels, its grey and snow-white blended in the froth. They swung about an angle in the highway out upon a wider pike which led straightway to a village small in size. For one brief second Stuyvesant dreamed that to halt in the town and demand protection might be advisable, but he almost as quickly abandoned the thought as an invitation to death. Not only was the settlement insignificant and the hour too early for its officers to be astir in the street, but the fiery projectile behind, belching red flame and scorching the very snow from its path, was heating to new efficiency and making perceptible gains. There was nothing on earth that Robley could do by way of giving more power to his car or heaving out freight to make it lighter. He could only attempt to hold his lead by absolutely reckless driving, hoping that some deserved catastrophe might overtake the minotaur of evil there behind. They shot through the village like a fury of battle hurled by a monstrous hurricane, frightful echoes of their Gatling fire thundering back from the houses, a sharp staccato like a pistol shot in the uproar of red-hot exhausts, pierced through the roaring of the car behind and told of a miss in one of her 6 great cylinders. 2 men and a dog had spun dizzily past, the sole signs of life in the village. Again that barking explosion came, and Stuyvesant's heart and his stampeding car leapt like animals together. He knew his pursuers were in trouble. By yards and rods the limousine was falling to the rear, lamed by the one bulking cylinder, now running, now dead for a second or less. It relinquished speed like a marathon runner facing a hill on the final lap of his race. A gap of nearly a mile extent was swiftly opened between the two as Stuyvesant held to his speed. Exultation burning in his pulses, flaring in his motor, and roaring in his wake made hot his frame, despite the biting wind and brightening of his eyes with triumph. He shot to the cover of a stretch of woods where the road wound westward like a river. A crack like a rifle's incisive note rang out on the air, and his car swerved wildly from the road. A tire had gone from the right fore wheel, and a spring was snapped as he wrenched her back and saved them from destruction. It was madness to drive at speed after that, and he groaned as he slowed her to reason. He had to keep on despite his flattened casing, and his wrist all but failed as he clung to the wheel, holding the cripple from plunging away on a tangent of death for them both. Almost simultaneously with the accident, the startling roar of the huge 6-cylinder came vibrantly and clearly on the wind. It was back in tune, with no more missing to cut its power down. "They'll catch us, Thurley," he called to the girl. "We've done for now on speed. She knew precisely what had happened. She knew how utterly mad it would be to race with a flattened front tire. On this rutted road it was not to be attempted for a moment. It would be fairly suicidal. She could think of nothing to say, and Stuyvesant shouted, "What shall we do?" The car was still racing, but slowly now, her speed perhaps sufficient to elude the pursuers for 5 or 6 minutes or more. "We couldn't hide?" cried Thurley, and Stuyvesant glanced at the woods. "There's just one chance," he called above the din, releasing the muffler cut out for the purpose. "Give me your cloak. You take my cap and furs. I'll get out and run so the devils can see me, and you drive on. They'll think it is I still driving, and you are running to hide. Slip off your cloak and be quick." He halted the car as he spoke. "But oh, if anything," Thurley started, when he interrupted quickly. "No time to talk or argue. It's the only chance. Your cloak." He had dropped off his great fur coat and clapped his cap upon her head. She rose, and he stripped her of the old grey garment, helping her swiftly into his furs and urging her into his seat. "If they catch you, Robley," she started as before. "I mustn't let—" "I love you," he said, in the stress and white heat of the moment. "I'd give my life to serve you. Quick, there isn't a moment to lose. Open her up as wide as you dare to drive, and don't stop for anything on earth." He leaped from the car and started for the woods, covered from heels to crown by the long grey cloak that Thurley had trailed in the night. "Good bye," he called. "Don't wait, don't wait. They're nearly in sight up the road." "Good bye," she replied, the tears swiftly springing in her softened eyes, and starting the car with her firm young skill, reinforced by the courage demanded by the moment. She was going again at dizzying speed when the huge limousine, belching and roaring with malevolence and bloodlust, shot into view around the bend, and Stuyvesant ran to a bit of brush and crouched as if to hide. One yell of satisfaction, barely audible to Robley, ascended from the pursuing car and informed him he had been seen. Almost at once the detonations of the limousine ceased. The car was halted, for the roadway bent a trifle, and the way to the woods was shorter from here than from where the fugitive had started. Both men leaped from the heated monster and started across the snow and broken ground, rapidly approaching the spot where Stuyvesant was hiding. He leaped to his feet, and through dry weeds ran as if staggering with terror. One man fell, but rose again, cursing the root that had thrown him down, and drawing his knife as he once more darted forward. It was Jan, and he quickly overtook his less fiendish comrade, with the quarry now nearly in his grasp. Stuyvesant felt for his pistol and nearly collapsed with the sudden memory he had left it in the car. For a moment he nearly went wild with disappointment, then adopted a desperate plan. Nothing but quickness and the great advantage of surprise could avail to save him now, and this he knew. He seemed to struggle on, when out of the corner of his eye he could see his pursuer's shadow, and in his ear caught the puff and snort of the fellow's breathing. He suddenly halted, turned like a flash, and struck the man with all his might fairly in the pit of his stomach. Down he went like a stricken bullock, doubled with agony, to writhe on the earth in pain and loss of breath. Leaping fairly across his helpless form, Stuyvesant met the German, Max, with an equally unexpected and unparried blow on the point of the chin, and saw him quiver where he fell. It was all accomplished in the briefest span, a matter made comparatively easy by the wholly unlooked-for method of attack. Panting and white with rage and his effort, Robley regarded the first of the two with his eyes that gleamed like steel. The creature was helpless, rolling his eyes in an anguish that did not subside. "You curs!" said Stuyvesant, taking up the knife that Jan had let fall from his hand, and starting at once to make further pursuit impossible, he ran and walked to their waiting car and clambered to the seat. For the first time then, as he made an attempt to grip the wheel with his hand, he realized that his wrist was gone from the blows he had just delivered. In its mending condition, it had been too weak to sustain the force of the shock. It was useless, though not again broken. He had hoped to take the limousine and continue after Thurley. Such a course was out of the question, but to wreck the car was well within his power. He made ready to leap, slipped in the clutch, speeded up as much as he dared, then, pushing the spark and the throttle forward, jumped out at the side and permitted the erstwhile roaring monster to rush unguided down the road. For a moment it clung to the straight bit of road like a thing endowed with life. Then, gathering speed and lunging forward like a maddened animal, it suddenly veered at the highway's curve and plunged with violence incredible down through a glade of the snow and ice, ramming a tree with an impact tremendous to behold. There was a crash of shattered glass, fierce grinding of sounds, the crunching of iron, and turmoil of twisting steel, and its wreckage and ruin were complete. Stuyvesant started down the road where Thurley had gone on foot. There was nothing else to do, no other place to go. He merely wondered how far she might have sped, how far he must walk to come to a village and get a train at last, perhaps with the princess, and perhaps alone. He glanced back repeatedly until at length he came to a turn of the highway, beyond which was an opening through the woods, affording a view of all the open space where he had met his murderous assailants. Until the place was hidden from his view, he saw no sign that either man had risen from the earth. He was going rapidly, merely intent upon making all possible progress, and inclined to believe that Thurley might attempt to secure assistance beyond and return again to the scene, when he was thoroughly astounded to discover his car standing unattended in the road some distance ahead, a bit of bluish mist between the wheels revealing the fact that the motor was in motion. He hastened his pace, alarmed anew as he saw no sign of Thurley. Then he came to the side of the trembling machine and glanced hurriedly about. Thurley had disappeared. For a moment, possessed with the wildest beliefs that some new calamity met in this direction had accomplished her destruction after all, he ran ahead, came back, called out her name, and searched all the wooded copse with a quickly roving gaze. Not a ruffling nor a track did the snow in that direction afford. On the road's other side the wind had cleared the frozen earth, making footprints out of the question. But he hastened there and beheld in the field, quite a distance away, something furry that lay in the snow. It was Thurley. When she drove away and left the scene where Stuyvesant, running and hiding, was inviting perhaps even death to overtake him, she had almost immediately suffered a sense of selfishness in attempting to escape while abandoning the man she knew she dearly loved. She had merely obeyed instructions hurriedly supplied. Then the limping car, bumping stiffly over frozen ruts, had presently added an element unforeseen. The seat cushion next to the one she occupied was jolted from its place. In a shallow receptacle where it had been placed lay Stuyvesant's revolver. The car had arrived at the turn of the road, affording a second view of the field where Stuyvesant was running. As Thurley looked, she beheld a man go down in a sudden encounter. She was certain it was Robley, viciously attacked by the creatures at her heels. She had halted the car, snatched up the revolver, and run with all her might toward the place half seen beyond. Then her foot struck a root. She plunged head foremost on the earth. The pistol was discharged, and she lay there motionless and white. End of chapter 42. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley Ruxton by Verrill MIGHELS. Chapter 43. A Joy Resisted. Stuyvesant came running to the place, the gravest fears overwhelming his sense of reflection. One impression only was his mind prepared to accept. A second foe had accomplished what the others had earlier failed to perform. The pistol gleaming in her hand sent a newer shock to his heart. He bent down at once, and raising Thurley's head, made a quick examination which revealed no sign of a wound. The bullet had done no harm. Thurley had struck on a frozen clod, and the blow had stunned her senses. Stuyvesant could not determine, however, the nature or extent of her injuries, and feared they were the worst. His mind was possessed by the thought of menace in all that wintry scene. He felt the most urgent necessity for getting her back to the car and far away without another moment's loss of time. He attempted to lift her prostrate form, but his wrist was far too weak. He merely succeeded in rolling her over and raising her head to his knee, but that was sufficient. Thurley returned to consciousness with astonishing celerity. Once more her position was altered. She opened her eyes and looked at Stuyvesant wistfully, as if some fear that she had only dreamed of this deliverance were colouring all her thoughts. "You're hurt," he said gravely. "What happened?" She could not immediately answer, but she presently said, "I fell. I was running to you with something, with your pistol. That was it." She raised herself abruptly, staring about her with blazing eyes. "Where are they?" she cried a little weakly. "But how have you? I thought I saw you fall. Oh, let's not wait another minute." Her nightmare of fears and horrors had rushed upon her relentlessly with consciousness fully returned. She struggled swiftly to her feet, her aspect one of alarm and apprehensions. "We're safe, at least from pursuit," he said, glancing far across the field of snow to the place where the Nihilists had fallen, "but we'll go at once and try to catch a train." With the pistol recovered and placed in his pocket, he threw off the cloak that had served them both, and, supporting her arm with the left hand, uninjured, conducted her back to the car. "I shall have to ask you to drive," he said, a grim little smile for a second curving his lips. "My hand is down and out again, from my hurry to get it back into use." Thurley was glad to take the wheel and start the car in motion. "What happened?" she said, still breathlessly excited. "How did you manage to escape? Oh, when I saw them after you, I felt the most awful sensations in the world." He told her a little of the happenings, and how he had wrecked the car. He placed the furs about them both to protect her from the wind, and at last he smiled again. "For the third fateful time you drive the car in my place, as I feared you might, but as neither could have expected." She looked at him once more in her wistful way, a way that went straight to his heart. "But you do think this is the last of these frights, that the charm is satisfied?" she asked. "There will be no more like this, with accident or horror in it all?" "No more," he answered solemnly. "And yet each time has drawn us nearer together." The colour burned up in her pallid cheeks superbly, a flash of the Thurley he had known and must love, though time and space and the greater abyss of hopeless separation attempted to dim its flame. Her eyes met his for a wonderful second, and both souls knew the deeps of love wherein they floated alone. The words he had spoken when they parted in the road, that swift declaration of his loyalty, love, and devotion, echoed anew in her welcoming heart, and filled all her pulses with joy. She thrilled to the words he uttered now, his grave recognition that the fates had drawn their two unwitting selves together, knitting a bond between their deepest spirits with a strength they could not resist. Yet even here, after all she had recently endured, she could not forget her word to Alice Van Kirk, nor fully accept this wonderful happiness vouchsafed in the wintry desolation. "We have had some extraordinary experiences together," she answered, smiling faintly. "It makes it seem as if we have known each other always." Stuyvesant had swiftly taken flame. Love bounded and surged in his veins. He felt that, more than any one living, he had rights in Thurley's life and happiness, rights that no other could assume. "We have known each other always," he said, "as two souls must, when life and chance, yes, nature and God, have wrought to fulfil such meetings, destinies, such comradeship as ours." He placed his hands on hers that grasped the wheel. "Thurley, I told you back in the road." "Oh, please," she begged him suddenly, her eyes swiftly brimming with exquisite joy and the need to curb his declaration, "would you please not tell me anything now? I mean, just tell me how you came." He felt that he understood, and yet he felt she loved him. Divine conviction of their oneness and their sublimated passion swept like a storm upon his nature, beating against the barrier he had felt and dreaded between them. Constraint, uncertainty, even pain and hurt were swiftly combined with the truths and necessities that he feared must still hold them apart. Yet, if he somewhat sounded the happiness and heart hunger for his love that throbbed in Thurley's bosom, he also felt convinced of her genuine wish to avoid the tender topic, and there, as in all else where her wishes lay, he was helpless to act in his own behalf, no matter what the penalty. His disappointment burned in his eyes along with the glow of his love. He could not take advantage of the situation that threw her thus helplessly upon his chivalry, and his heart, protesting, was dumb. "I came because I could not hesitate," he told her simply, and briefly he recounted all that had happened to himself, Alice, and the Baron since the moment the abduction was complete. Thurley broke out from time to time with a note of surprise, sympathy, of indignation when she learned of Pelivan's entire duplicity. Her worry and compassion had their expression when he told her of the long, hard ride with his man and the unseen attack that had laid his chauffeur on the earth. "You must send a nurse at once," she declared, when she learned the object of his early morning excursion. "Perhaps you could put me on a train for New York, and go back with a nurse in an hour." "I shall take you home," he answered. "You have told me nothing of all this atrocious business, how it happened, how you got away." She related everything, glad to share the horrors of her days and nights with one who would understand. She shuddered anew over all she had endured in those final hours of escape and flight and struggle with the cold. Her hand went out involuntarily a second to grasp the sleeve of his coat, so vivid were the moments lived again in her imagination. A sacred joy leaped exultantly in his heart at the little sign of her confidence. Then her hand returned to the wheel again and the duty of guiding the car. It was still fairly early in the morning, with the sun warmly blazing from a cloudless sky at last, when they came to a city on the railroad and learned that a New York Limited was due in 20 minutes. They phoned to Alice, devoured a breakfast of rolls and coffee, placed the car in charge of a local garage, and summoned a nurse to go at once to Banks in North Winnig. Then they were speeded home, missing the carriage Alice had sent to the ferry, where Robley had taken a taxicab at the moment of arriving. a white and fluttering fairy godmother, the victim of sudden reactions and relaxings of nervous strain, at last clasped Thurley somewhat hysterically to her bosom, and cried, for the joy she had felt was gone past all recalling. Robley was sent to his physician for needed attention to his wrist, and the princess was finally sent to bed, where she sank into slumber like a child. The chapter of violent occurrences was destined to achieve a fitting close. All North Winnig, tremendously shaken by the crime committed at their very doors, had aroused like a congress of sheriffs. At noon, in the old abandoned house where Thurley had been imprisoned, they came upon a dreadful sight, where Jan and Zagorski, still clutching knives, lay slain by one another. Pelivan and Max had fled. What duel of words, recriminations, and passions had preceded the deadly combat waged with steel, no witness was ever to reveal. Mute testimony of the fierce and savage conflict between the man and woman was supplied by everything about the room where they had fought, and the hatred of man and distrust of their kind, which alone must actuate the fanatical nihilist, was frozen indelibly upon their features as they lay there stark and cold. End of chapter 43. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley Ruxton by Verrill MIGHELS. Chapter 44. Unexpected Aid. It was fully 2 days before Thurley and Alice were sufficiently recovered to resume their ways of life. That Thurley was not completely prostrated was solely to the credit of her will, her courage, and her magnificently perfect health. The news had gone rapidly about the circle that the princess had returned, and for once the daily papers were unaware of the vital facts in the story. No one save Stuyvesant, Alice, and the Baron had been authentically informed of what had taken place. As if all eagerness to regain lost ground and gratify desires and appetites merely whetted by Thurley's absence from the scene, her numerous admiring swains redoubled their former efforts for her favour. Whole shops full of flowers trooped fragrantly in at the mansion's doors, rivalled only by white-winged invitations to opera parties, cotillions, dinners, receptions, with which all swelldom inundated Alice and her protégé. Baron von Hochhaus, duly informed as to Thurley's safe return, desired to call at the earliest moment rendered possible by grave complications of his business. Count Faïschi was fired with pent-up ardour which could scarcely wait to be conventional or restrained for another hour. His insistence, indeed, roused Thurley to a sense of resentment most diverting from her recent terrifying adventures. But her one great happiness now was Alice. They two had been knitted to a sweet relationship that was second only to that of mother and daughter. Alice had clung to her just a little wildly, accusing herself of having made the girl's dread experience possible, and declaring her frights, her despair, and her love repeatedly. She had hung upon every word and moment of the narrative, breathless and white with each succeeding anguish that Thurley had endured, and she had since become childishly loath to see her princess depart from her sight for so much as a moment. This was the partially restored condition of affairs at the great Fifth Avenue Palace, when Acton Gaylord, driven to final desperation, telephoned to Thurley on Wednesday afternoon for a private interview. "I have "Something important to say, to request," he told her, his voice harsh and hoarse on the wire. "It is nothing for myself, but something concerning a certain man who has thrust his attentions upon you, a certain Count. I beg you to let me come." Thurley had told him to come. He arrived at 4, a haggard, nerveless being, as remotely related to the Gaylord she had known as a dried and frozen rill is related to the boisterous and arrogant brook of the spring. She was shocked at his appearance, unaware either that Faishi had driven him finally to the blackest rim of ruin, or that matters of money could so undermine and sap a strong man's strength. "I haven't much to tell you after all," he said with a sickly sort of smile, when the mere conventions of their meeting had been satisfied. "But I felt I must beg this chance of warning you that Count Faishi is an utterly unscrupulous cur, with whom to associate is a degradation. I have known him a year. I have no wish to gabble of his shameless liaisons, his abominable affairs on the Continent, his glaring duplicities, or a score of transactions barely less than crimes, but I couldn't rest till I let you know a little of what he is. I have really come for that, and also to implore you, in the name of everything decent and American, to expel this charlatan, this leech and dog, from your circle." Thoroughly already sufficiently informed as to the Count Faishi's detestable characteristics, was nevertheless a little curious to know what Gaylord meant, and what he might also know. "Your indictment is very positive," she said. "You must be prepared to prove a case against him." "I could prove 100 with a little time," answered Gaylord emphatically. "I have made no preparations for any such exposure. It was neither my way nor my duty. He has been my business partner. He has used my confidence for my ruin. He has beaten me, ruined me, working on my business word and honour, all in his effort to thrust me aside from his path to you. It is not for that I am here, however, smirching the man behind his back. I can take my beating, the wreckage, everything, if only I can be assured that through it he shall not triumph here. And understand, I have realized at last my own mistakes of the past and the place where I put myself, but I almost feel I could murder this whelp if he's also blinded you." His emotions were tremendous. They shook him as if they were masters. In his pale, livid face only his 2 eyes seemed alive, burning with the concentrated intensity of his angered being. Thurley gazed at him astonished. She had no thought of Faishi now as an element of menace in her life. She thought of him only as a monster in whose tentacles the man before her appeared to be strangely helpless. She felt Gaylord's helplessness, his surrender in some mighty struggle, doubtless waged with all his stubborn strength against some unseen treachery he was powerless to meet. Her resentment against Faishi, already vigorously and impatient, was like a metal fulminate requiring only a spark to flash out a shattering explosion. "Do you think," she said, with simulated calm she was far from feeling, "that the Count has dealt unfairly with you for any reason at all concerned with me?" "To put me out of the running," Gaylord answered hotly. "That's the part I couldn't stand. When a man is my partner and does a thing like that, I'd do almost anything to snatch away the prize he thinks he has won." Thurley's eyes blazed and steadied as she looked upon Gaylord's face. "Would you mind telling me a little of how he has beaten you in business?" Gaylord failed to understand. He expected that Thurley at the end would attempt a defence of the Count, Perhaps for that reason he made more clear, more naked and complete, the revelations hotly poured from his lips. He told of his first discoveries that Faishi, supposed to be his friend as well as business associate and partner in the enterprise, had begun to undermine his credit. He added item after item of the Count's intrigue and hidden manoeuvres to compass his absolute ruin. "I fought all last week. When I thought I was done," he added in conclusion, rising to pace the floor and halting to mark his point, "and I made another loan. It was all I could get. I thought it would tide me over. Now he has engineered the final coup in buying up some notes of mine, of course through a friend, and insisting on payments that cannot be made, and so I rise to take the gaff." His smile was ghastly, mirthless attempt, such as one would expect on the lips of a warrior who, about to die, salutes great Caesar on his throne. He added, "I suppose he who takes up the street must perish by the street, but partners should be square." Thurley was stirred to the depths of her womanly nature. Gaillard, she knew, had confessed his failure in the fight he had waged with a species of relief as to one who had once been something more than just a social acquaintance. She felt indeed that she was the only one to whom it could have been told, and therein she was right. She controlled her one great impulse by a splendid effort of will, but her course was as clear as the wind. "When must it end?" she inquired. "When must you meet your obligations or go under?" "Tomorrow afternoon." "And how much money would it need to pay, I mean to win?" "To win?" He smiled again and shook his head. "Nearly $25,000. Her excitement grew intense. The colour flamed upward in her cheeks superbly. "Then 30,000 would make it absolutely certain?" "Absolutely. However, I might as well wish for 30 millions. But why?" "I wish to let you have it," she interrupted feverishly, her eyes ablaze with the prospect of Faishi's defeat. "Please don't ask me why to day, but say that you'll take it and win." Gaillard stared. "You wish me to beat Faishi?" "More than anything in all the—" "You'll take it? You'll let me help?" "But if I should lose, after all, be a year or more repaying—" "You mustn't lose. You shan't. You're too American. Will you take the money and come out on top in the end?" "I will, by heaven," he answered, a surge of colour leaping for the first time to his face. "Thurley, please." "Nothing but your consent," she interrupted. "I'll go at once and get the cheque." And presently Gaillard left the house, the bit of paper in his pocket, and wonder and fire in his soul. It was strange that even in his humbled mood he could not understand. He was certain a spark of her former love had ignited Thurley's heart. Thurley, on her part, as thoroughly convinced that her action would be instantly comprehended, went to Alice radiantly excited. "He's gone," she said. "I don't suppose you saw him?" "As pale as a pan of dough and frightfully nervous. I have lent him $30,000. Alice suppressed a gasp, but looked at her, stunned with amazement. She merely said, "Acton Gaillard?" Thurley realised abruptly that the shock to Alice was staggering, though the reason escaped her intuitions. "Why, yes, do you very much mind?" she asked anxiously. "I guess I did it before I realised that the money—" "The money was yours to dispose of as you please," Alice interrupted, smiling peculiarly. "Do you feel like a drive to Mrs. Ashley Duane's? Lady Calthorpe has something important to communicate, and hoped we'd come this afternoon." "Why, yes," said Thurley, a little afraid she had overstepped the mark at last, and sacrificed the confidence that Alice had heretofore reposed in all her words and actions. "Have I done something very wrong or foolish?" "Certainly not," said Alice, almost reassuringly. But may I ask if Acton requested such a loan?" "Oh, not in the least," said Thurley sturdily. "It surprised him as much as it seemed to astonish you." Alice kissed her to dispel a line of worry on her brow. "Then perhaps he's as fortunate as I, dear child, so go and be dressed in a hurry." Thurley went off to her own boudoir, much puzzled in her mind. End of chapter 44. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley Ruxton by Verrill MIGHELS. Chapter 45. A Drove of Lions. The elements essential to a logical climax of the innocent royal diversion that Alice Van Kirk had permitted, with Thurley as the central figure, were swiftly gathering when on Friday afternoon two widely opposed individuals made their appearance at the Fifth Avenue mansion. One of the visitors was Robley Stuyvesant, the other was Pelivan. Each had purposely chosen a moment of Thurley's absence from the palace, the better to further his ends. Pelivan came in the guise of a servant seeking employment as footman. He made his application in the region below stairs, where such an incident, though decidedly unusual, excited no particular interest, and certainly no disquietude. His desires were immediately communicated to the mistress of the house, who promptly, but in a spirit of kindness, replied that her retinue afforded no vacancies, wherefore she regretted her inability to accommodate another servant. Pelivan, as a matter of fact, had expected some such reply. During the few close-packed minutes of his stay, however, he had managed to acquire a number of important facts concerning the plan of the house, the number of its servants, their duties, and a little of the ways of life of those who resided above. When he presently departed, he was singularly undepressed, for one who desires for employment had met with so little encouragement. Even the servants to whom he had spoken were a trifle suspicious of his manner, but his visit was soon forgotten. Stuyvesant, bent on a mission as vital to himself as that which brought Pelivan, seemed to Alice a trifle constrained when he entered the room where she was sitting. It was her own retreat, the room in which she had always received him before, an apartment where the very atmosphere was charged with discussions of Thurley. It was destined to be charged anew to-day. "Well, Robley," said Alice, once more restored to her lighter, more jovial mood, "you appear as chipper and gay as a clam. Has someone died and left you another fortune?" Stuyvesant attempted to smile, but its failure verged on the tragic. "I'm all right," he asserted, but without convincing emphasis. "I just dropped in to ask if by any chance you and Miss Thurley may have received a letter addressed to me, intended for me, would be more accurate, and perhaps directed wrongly by mistake." "Why, yes," said Alice. "Thurley brought me some epistle this morning, and we sent it at once to your address. At least it was posted by noon. Why, was it anything unduly important?" "I must ask you what comprised its text?" "Oh, it was just a sort of business announcement, I should say. Something about some bonds, a special concession from the Paris Bourse. If I remember correctly, it merely directed your attention to the fact that investments were now made possible in some sort of continental bonds." "Did it come from the office of Acton Gaylord?" His gravity impressed her inescapably. "Why, yes. We rather wondered, of course. I felt convinced that some blunder of mixing envelopes. Perhaps you received some other note or letter addressed to Thurley?" "I did," said Stuyvesant, his face peculiarly drawn. I have brought it with me, thinking it might be of value." He drew an envelope from his pocket, removed a folded sheet of writing paper, and placed it in Alice's hand. She took it with a sense of ominous impending. It was the briefest bit of scrawl. "Dear Thurley, just a formal receipt acknowledging the loan of your $30,000. You must let me come Friday night as per my earlier request. With love, Acton." Alice read it at a glance, and the colour mounted swiftly to her face. A more provoking accident she could scarcely imagine occurring at this particular time. She looked up presently and met a somewhat stern and chilling gaze from Robley's blue-grey eyes. There seemed to be nothing adequate to say and nothing to do. She tried to smile. "Well?" "It's true," he said. "She has made him this loan?" Alice arched her brows. "My dear Robley, isn't that rather a matter of her concern alone?" He rose and rammed his hands in his pockets. "Obviously, you realize, of course, Alice, that I made this discovery through no fault or prying of my own." "Is it necessary to state that, Robley?" His manner altered instantly. "Oh, I'm hardly responsible for what I may say or do. This thing has jarred me, that's all." She looked out at the window. "Well, it jarred me." "You knew about it before?" "She told me she had lent him the money." "What do you make of it, if I may ask?" "I made a wry face over it," said Alice, "but what is the use?" "Then it doesn't make you happy?" "Very few of the world's occurrences seem designed for my particular joy." He crossed to another window and stood there, staring out at the park. "I admit I've been a fool enough to dream dreams," he confessed, after a moment of silence. "I could, I believe, have accepted philosophically anything that the needs of a nation at the hands of this young Grand Duke, anything that political necessity. Hadn't you seen any signs of this relationship with Gaylord?" "Oh, perhaps, but I thought—" She did not finish, but shrugged her shoulders instead. "Had he met her before?" "Oh, so I hear." "You weren't consulted first about this loan?" Alice smiled as before, without mirth or special meaning. "My dear Robley, we must neither of us forget that Thurley is of age and the mistress of her own affairs." "Oh, but this Gaylord!" he exclaimed impatiently. "I suppose he's coming here to-night?" "I believe he is." He turned and looked at her squarely, his fine face re-chiselled in its lines. "I couldn't have believed it, Alice, if I hadn't had this accidental notice." "Accidental?" she echoed. "You don't really think Mr. Gaylord—" "The mixing of envelopes doesn't often occur in business man's office without express intent," he answered incisively. "Still, I may, of course, be mistaken." "He couldn't be such a cad," said Alice, "although I might have expected—" "Oh, Robley, let's not attempt to judge, to settle, to do anything about this unfortunate matter here this afternoon. Come and see Thurley for yourself." "To-night?" "Good heavens, no! I don't know how we're going to manage. Come to-morrow or Sunday. Come when you're calmer, anyway. It's so easy to make mistakes." "Alice, you really wish to encourage me to hope?" "To hope for what?" "You know how I feel toward your protégé, but I don't know how she feels toward you, and if I did, my dear boy, I've about made up my mind that the fates will have their way, no matter who it pinches, that's all. Now do say good-bye and go." He had barely gone when one of the servants brought her a letter delivered, he said, by special messenger awaiting to take reply. The letter was directed to Alice. It came from Baron von Hotchhouse on affairs of the young Grand Duke. Alice read it with amusement of a kind. It was not, however, a humorous epistle. It was practically a warning that the ardent and somewhat unmanageable young Karl Wilhelm, Grand Duke of Saxe-Herzenheimer, desired to honour himself by calling that evening, unless his visit should be inconvenient or untimely. In the midst of the letter's perusal, Thurley returned, fresh from a gallop in the park with her groom and a special guardian on whose attendance Alice had insisted. Alice called her at once to hear the note, particularly the postscript, which read as follows: "I am practically powerless to avert this adventure on the part of His Excellency Karl Wilhelm, and I therefore take this means and occasion to state that Princess Thurvinia, recently discovered and found to be quite ill, is by the grace of God so miraculously improved that her immediate return to Europe is contemplated. You will readily understand, I am certain, and perhaps even pardon me, if I refer to a former conversation with yourself, in which I suggested the service possible to Herzogenaurach in a complete discouragement of the Grand Duke by one of the noblest young women it has ever been my pleasure to encounter. May I beg a little further indulgence in behalf of my worried and disordered country." Thoroughly already acquainted with the outcome of the Baron's former visit during the time of her own despair and anguish, was now amazed to learn of the finding of the actual princess. She was perhaps also a little startled concerning possible results. She entirely overlooked the point that appealed to Alice. "Does it mean that that discovery, does it mean very much to us?" she inquired gravely, looking at Alice in her girlish, wistful way. "You can take it as part of the joke?" "Oh, it isn't that, my dear," said Alice, lightly enough. "I was thinking how utterly absurd it is for Acton Gaylord, the Count, and now the Duke, to insist, as they have, on coming here all in one evening, all together, or one blend the other, perhaps, for I hardly suppose you'd enter the cage with all your 3 lions in a drove." "Oh, he does want to come to night, of course," said Thurley, still distinctly serious. "I had completely forgotten. But Count Fieschi's to come by 8 and be gone in 15 minutes. Mr. Gaylord arrives at 8:30, and—" Her eyes flashed fun and warmth. "Why not let the Duke be last, at 9 o'clock? I think I'd like it. 3 within the hour." "I thought so, or thought perhaps it might be entertaining," answered Alice, aware of the general reception planned for the Count, but puzzled still by Thurley's attitude with Gaylord. "Shall I answer 9 to-night?" "You may as well," said Thurley. "I've heard there's a charm in 3s." How easy it was to remember the things that Robley had declared. How eagerly, gladly, and naturally her thoughts went forth to find him day and night. How she treasured the flowers that came from his hand among the houseful constantly arriving, and how often she wished she could tell him things, share with him all the long day's happenings, in the way that comrades should. "Charms and 3s," repeated Alice. "I should hope there might be some few charms distributed among this oddly assorted trio, but I greatly rejoice that the Counts have all been discovered." The Count, as a matter of fact, had been more than discovered recently. He had been a bit exposed, likewise a bit defeated, and was blissfully unaware either pertinent occurrence. Not only had Gaylord rounded on him brilliantly, recouping lost ground with a second burst of skill inspired by Thurley's unexpected help and attitude, but the all-important intelligence imparted by Lady Honor Calthrop at this tea was of such a nature that Alice was radiant with joy. The hour had come to mete out punishments for things endured under the laws of the social world, and Alice was a woman. Thurley had drifted far away on a thought of the young Duke Karl. "Some of his ways are very charming," she said. I felt that you thought so too." Alice, who had spoken to the Count, betrayed new surprise. She felt she should never in the least know Thurley after all. "Why, yes," she agreed, "but there are charms and charms, and fortunately no man has them all. Poor little Zora Norton married a very charming creature 3 years ago. The last time I saw her she looked at me like a Dresden china shepherdess, and sweetly lisped, 'Doesn't a woman have to love her husband an awful lot not to hate him utterly?' I've thought it often since." "But," said Thurley, "aren't you glad you're married?" Alice smiled. "My dear, I like the changes of climate. I'm hardy enough to endure them, and they make me hardier for more. Now I think you'd better rest a while, for you're 3 in tandem tonight." Thurley felt a great excitement instantly assert itself, so much did the meetings presage. "I'll rest if I can," she answered, and went to the care of her maids. End of chapter 45. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley Ruxton by Verrill MIGHELS. Chapter 46. Answering the Count. Thurley did not rest. Her brain was too alive, and the fever too active in her pulses. Mysterious arrivals, plus an air of hurry and excitement, pervaded all the house. She suffered herself to be dressed for dinner in a dainty gown that, with its softness and its frailty, completely belied the strength, the courage, and the resolution with which she was amply endowed. Major Phipps appeared in time for dinner. He was, if possible, more tanned, more explosive, and more hearty than ever before. His admiration for Thurley was likewise more pronounced. He bragged of her discovery quite immodestly, taking such mountains of credit to himself that Alice was thoroughly shadowed. "'Tis one truly noteworthy and creditable achievement of my career, by George," he asserted. "Re-establishes my mental acumen, it does, sir. I've said so repeatedly. But by the gods of battle, that satisfaction is nothing compared with the fatherly affection engendered in my breast, fatherly and brotherly and unclish and angelic," Alice supplied dryly. "It's very beautiful and touching, but will you kindly indicate whether or not you will have some peas, thereby providing a moment for Thurley's blushes to subside?" Thurley's colour, however, was destined for the briefest subsistence. The Major kept it flaming pleasurably for an hour, both during and after dinner, and 8 o'clock romped in upon them all. It seemed quite prematurely to ignite it again. Alice herself was nervously perturbed and a trifle feverish when one of the servants came to announce the arrival of Count Faïschi. The Major excused himself in haste and promptly disappeared. Alice, in one of her motherly moods, came swiftly to her princess and placed both hands on her shoulders. "Because he happened to demand that he see you alone is no reason why Faïschi should be gratified unless you wish it," she said. "I feel as if perhaps it might be much easier if I remained with you as chaperone all the time he is here." "If the horrid creature should attempt what he did before," Thurley halted, vividly remembering the kiss that Faïschi had dared to misappropriate. "Of course he wouldn't if you were there, and yet if he's here to demand, perhaps the way we have planned it is the best after all. You're sure that that everything is ready?" "Leave it to me," said Alice, a little pale, but smiling. "I'll go with you now and excuse myself at once." They went together to the golden room, where the Count was impatiently waiting. He was flushed with a sense of victory over Gaylord and his own irresistible prowess with the woman. He had sent great masses of roses earlier, and was certain now that the single American beauty worn on Thurley's bosom was selected from his offering. He could never have dreamed it was Syren's rose, worn as a token of their comradeship and also as a talisman to guard her heart from evil. To do him credit for mere physical appearance, the Count had never been handsomer in his life. His glossy black hair, his damask skin, and his long-lashed eyes, which burned like molten garnets, dashed with liquid whirls of brown and ebony, were practically physical perfection. Only his mouth, over-red and sensuous, supplied a hint of the animal crouched behind his mask. He wasted no energy in passing the time of day. "Ah, the banishment of all the little fidgeting world!" he exclaimed in immediate rapture as Thurley and Alice advanced to give him formal greeting. "By division of yourself, I am transported, yes, as on the wings of ecstasy that for the highest exaltation shall exist," and he took Thurley's hand to raise it toward his lips, almost ignoring Alice, to whom he should have first addressed himself. Thurley smiled conventionally, withdrawing her hand with a firm, slow gesture, at once reserved and vigorous. "How interesting if visions took the place of aeroplanes," she answered lightly. "It is said the transportation business is very profitable." "Ah," said Fieschi, "Madame Van Kirk, I am charmed likewise at this encounter. Yes." "Only charmed?" said Alice, arching her brows. "Not one little flight when you see me? Perhaps you wish to surprise me later." Thurley felt her heart give a knock at the hidden suggestion. "Ah," said the Count, "it is not a fault to be blind. It is one of affliction. Shall I not be blind when I thus behold Miss Thurley?" To give him due credit, once again Thurley was matchless, brilliantly, bewilderingly beautiful. The animation of suppressed excitement, plus the fire of resentment, outblazing jewel marvels in her eyes, her colour and her pulses vibrant with life, reduced to sheer loveliness and magnetism. Never had prettier partition grace enthroned itself in her carriage. Her golden hair was such a coronet as regal simplicity might choose for its dainty queen. Her arms and her shoulders were superb. Ariel, Titania, Diana, the exquisite beings and goddesses of all the ages, might have bequeathed her a tithe apiece of their own loveliness to make her the princess she was. "Blind?" said Alice. "I have often wondered if love is so blind that a married man cannot see another pretty woman." If the Count changed colour for a second, he instantly laughed it away. "Ah, this American wit," said he. "The rapier is not more quick, more certain." He was ill at ease with Alice in the room, but concealed his impatience with some degree of art. "Well," said Alice, shrugging her shoulders, "since I am not seen, perhaps I may be excused for a moment, by your leave." Fieschi made little concealment of his pleasure, thus to be left alone with Thurley. No sooner was Alice gone than he strode hot paced to where the princess had taken a seat. She rose at once, not to be taken at the slightest disadvantage. "For this a moment I have lived and could have died," he breathed with suddenly liberated fervour, once more catching up her hand and attempting to press his lips upon it. "If it were only that some word were sufficiently beautiful to name you in, some word more fragrant, more passionate, more enraptured than divinity. Ah, how my soul would leap to its birth, to lay it at your feet, my idol, my—" "Will you not be seated?" Thurley interrupted, her breath coming quickly, her anger rising as she felt the insult of his words and glances, while his eyes sought to rivet her own. You mention in your note some special reason for an interview? Ah, and you have not guessed? You have not been aware of my soul's desire, my famishing of the spirit, my heart's consuming thirst? I did not suppose even walls, the horrible tumult of the city, anything could upon it avail to close it out. But I have waited its accomplishment. How, God alone knows, this waiting. But I wished to come with my hands, my arms, brimming with fortune. It is done. I have come tonight to tell me you have made a fortune. May I offer my congratulations? Thurley was a little fearful of his ardour, fearful of some spring of the animal she felt behind his smile and eyes. She could only hope for a moment to dash his heats with the coldly commonplace. As well might she have attempted to dash a Vesuvian eruption. The fortune, bah! Said Faishi more warmly than before, his hands fairly wrung and perspiring with impatience to clasp her hotly by the arms and to strain her lips to his. It is a bauble only, to drop at your feet and forget. But the love I lavish, the adoration— Listen, said Thurley, interrupting desperately. I thought I heard the bell. I must ask your pardon if I presently have to excuse myself. I am expecting another caller who is likewise coming on business. Business? Echoed Faishi. Business? Thurley's strength came surging to her aid. What else could it be you particularly wished to say? The Count was increasingly agitated. It is not a business, the mighty demand of the soul, he cried to her fervently. Yet I have tried to ask before, and I ask again, a definite answer from your heart, your lips. You are now already my soul's one choice, my all. But you will be my wife? Thurley paled when it came, prepared as she was to hear his declaration and request. Anger and scorn flared quickly in her eyes, despite her efforts at control. Your answer to that? She asked lightly, clasping her hands and trembling with surcharged dynamics of the moment. Your answer, Count Faishi, is here. A door behind him had opened at the signal. He turned like a cat as her glance sped past his shoulder. Countess Faishi, who had come here once to threaten, and if need be to fight for her rights, came haltingly into the room in front of Alice. She was white as paper. She put out her hand to support herself from falling, weakly groping for a chair nearby, as her eyes remained fixed on the Count. "Volgame Dios!" breathed the suddenly wilted Faishi. "Por amor de Dios y todos los santos!" "It is my right to come," cried the trembling wife, by way of meeting the blazing anger, shame, and accusation flaring in his gaze. "Forgive me, José. It is my love. I could not bear to let you go." She went down abruptly on her knees at his feet and clasped him wildly by the legs. "God help me if I love you so," she added, "for I was sure I had my love from God." "Oh, Thurley," said Alice quietly, "may I see you for a moment?" Thurley turned to the Count, who remained there livid and helplessly staring at his wife. "You will excuse me, I'm sure, if I say good evening." But the Count had been stricken deaf and dumb, as well as pallid and blind. He made no reply as Thurley and Alice quitted the room and left him fully answered. Later they heard the closing of the door that led to the outside world. A servant came to announce, in accordance with directions, that the Count and Countess were gone. The evening had fairly begun. End of chapter 46. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley Ruxton by Verrill MIGHELS. Chapter 47. A Thoroughbred. Gaylord had rarely in his life felt more assured, more confident, restored, or at his ease. The man was amazingly transformed. There is no such tonic as victory with a dash of self-approval. He had entered on his flight against Faishi with a vigour so reinforced and dominant that the Count could scarcely have recognized the man he had encountered. He had smashed his way to supremacy in the situation with a power that astonished himself. Tonight he was firmly on his feet again, and looked the part. His skin was clear and ruddy, his eyes were steadied and apparently hardened to a new blued steel species of temper. With composure regained and buoyancy reasserted in his step and carriage, he felt himself once more master of his destiny and able to cope with the world. Thurley was honestly glad to behold a change so complete and unexpected. She had once felt untold admiration for the qualities crystallized in Gaylord's composition. A slight reoccurrence of her old-time appreciation of his better self stirred in her being tonight. She knew he had beaten Faishi, and for that she rejoiced as a friend. "You see, I couldn't wait, and my wish to tell it all in person," he explained, holding her hands as she faced him there alone. "I wanted to come and acknowledge frankly that you saved the situation. I wanted to know that you are glad as I see in your eyes you are." "It gratifies me very much," she told him sincerely. "If I helped a little, I rejoice." She withdrew her hands and asked him to find himself a seat. He drew a chair close to hers and leaned familiarly forward, reaching to take her hand again where she leaned on a golden stand. With a motion apparently slow and unintentional, she placed the hand in her lap. "Thoroughly," he said, in the modulated tone she had once responded to with thrills, "you're a noble little girl, the finest little woman I have known in all the world." "Thank you," she answered lightly. "We are both still rather young." He was not to be diverted from his purpose. He seemed almost not to have heard her reply. "You know, I told you once upon a time there was no one like you, Thurley. I told you that you were a thoroughbred, remember?" Thurley grew more self-possessed. "I recall could it have been in connection with anything in particular?" "Oh, come, little girl, you remember," he said. "I'll face it, take my medicine, everything I deserve. I thought at one time I was doomed for the axe, but thank God your spirit's too big for petty revenge. You are a thoroughbred, I knew it all along. But heavens, little captain of the Tigress, what a wonderful relief, what an unthinkable happiness to get back to our good old chumming again, and forget all that's gone between." This time he caught her hand so swiftly and with a grip so sure that she had neither time nor strength to escape. "You're hurting my fingers," she told him, unmoved by his speech. "Please sit back in your chair, Mr. Gaylord." And "Mr. Gaylord!" he echoed abruptly. She smiled and arched her brows. "What else should I say?" "Do you mean to keep this up?" he said. "Come now, Thurley, be yourself. You've punished me enough." "Punished you? For what?" "You know what I mean. What does a college graduate know of what he wants or says or does at a time like that? You've punished me thoroughly, and you know it." "Isn't it just the usual college sort of thing?" She forced a smile, which his egotism misinterpreted. "You little rogue," he answered, doing his best to outmatch her mirth and laugh her mood away. "We cared for each other, as you cannot deny, and that sort of caring lasts. If not, then why your friendship now, when you saw me down and out?" "I agree to friendship heartily," she said. "I honestly wish—" "Oh, it's more than that, little girl," he interrupted, leaning closer as before. "Now tell me candidly, like the candid little girl I've always known. Why did you fly to my assistance with $30,000? Her face was grave, even pale. She faced him steadily. In the first place, I very much wished you to beat that man, Count Fieschi. Yes, I felt that, of course. I understood all that. But the real reason, Thurley, that's the one I'm after. He was sure of the corner to which she was forced. Sure she would not evade. Sure she would melt, as in the early days, and tell him what he wished to know, if only with her eyes. She did not evade, and her eyes were eloquent of truth. I have been long anxious to repay you for all the flowers and chocolates, the attentions, kindnesses, and college friendship, she answered in a clear, low voice that surprised herself, so violent was the beating of her heart. I have wished to even up the favours, and to show you that sort of friendship I learned was all I should ever have expected there at home. I wished to preserve the friendly feeling you have always entertained. I hope I have, and I hope you understand. He could not fail to understand, with a glaring vividness that left him stunned and dazed. He was placed under lifelong obligations, and cast to the outer regions where a formal, half-cold friendship was all he could ever expect. The dominant power, once his and neglected, had melted into air and gone for ever. The sense of it all crept through and over him with the tangible effect of a tide, chilling his being through and through. He was silent for a moment, staring at her fixedly. When he spoke, his voice had changed. "You mean that, Thurley? That's your final word?" She met his gaze unflinchingly. "You asked me to be candid. I have taken you at your word." She marvelled at the ease with which she answered. A reactionary passion rose for a final beating against the barriers within him. The old self, yet to be outgrown, once more took possession of his mood. He rose in his heat. "By heaven," he said, "if I'd known of this, I'd never have taken your help, your money, anything. You haven't the right. You'd better be careful, Thurley, how you play with a man like this. Your position here, this masquerade—" "Don't threaten again to divulge it, please, for your own sake," she interrupted. "It would be so useless after what I have planned for myself. It would rob me so utterly of all I have remaining of the Acton Gaylord I'm sure I used to know." "You've tricked me," he said, less truculently. "You are living a trick. Your head has been turned. You seem to think— Oh, Thurley, I don't mean all this madness. I'm not an absolute cad. But this thing hits me. When I was sure, when I thought you'd forgiven— Forget what I've said. Tell me you didn't mean it. I want to be friends, be all I ever was and more. I want a chance to prove I'm a better friend than you think. I've confessed my blunder made at college. Let's be friends again and begin all over where we were." Thurley, too, had risen. She had never felt more distant from him, more ostracised by all that he said or did, nor yet more sorry or helpless. She looked him a little wistfully, poignantly affected by it all. "I want your friendship, believe me," she said. "I want it very much, and to give you mine, the most that I can offer." Something occurred deep down in his nature to alter his view of himself. His face was twitching with the struggle of his better entity to force itself to the top. "All you can offer," he said, peculiarly, as much to himself as to Thurley, and he nodded his head with a grim, if belated, comprehension of what it implied. "I've made a fool of myself." A ghastly sort of smile played for a moment over his features. "Will you shake hands, Thurley, for goodbye? Will you let me tell you again in a different way, you are a thoroughbred?" She gave him her hand, which he gripped as he might have clasped a man's. "You're more than that," he added huskily. "You're a princess, if ever one lived." He sounded the light in her frank brown eyes, finding there nothing but the truth. "Ah, good-bye," he murmured. "God keep you as you are." And Thurley sat down when the door had closed, wondering at it all. She was there when Alice entered, excited by new events. "The Duke has been here for nearly 15 minutes," she said, "and now here's the Baron and Wank." "I know," said the Princess, smiling faintly. "I wrote and asked them to come." "Good Lord," said Alice, "talk about the Sphinx. I just saw number 2 go out, Acton, of course, and looking more as if he'd found himself than I think I somehow expected." "Oh, I'm glad," said Thurley honestly. "That makes me very happy." Alice looked her disconcerted puzzlement. After all her hopes, she was nearly convinced that Gaylord still possessed the girl's real heart, in spite of all that had happened. "The Duke is wearing out his shoes, his pocket, and his intellect," she stated in her customary spirit. "Will you have him in with his tamer, or alone?" Thurley smiled a little wearily. "He probably prefers to come alone, like all the others." "You poor dear child," said Alice, and kissed her in sympathy and love. End of chapter 47. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley Ruxton by Verrill MIGHELS. Chapter 48. A Climax. The something boyishly honest in the Duke, a charming quality that Thurley had previously enjoyed, beset her now as she forced him candidly, resolved to win him to the plan that she felt would make for the happiness of all. He was dressed as colonel of the Baron's regiment von Seydlitz, and was splendid and good to see. She found the matter difficult in the light of his repeated protestations that he would not return to Herzegovina without her, and that kingdoms were hateful in his sight. "You see, you haven't been fair," she said, smiling to take away the sting. "When you knew I was not the princess, but the merest no one in America, you treated me quite as if you had never met your fiancé, and were ready to let me think you thought me she. You'll admit to me now that you knew it all from the first." He nodded. "And that I was your slave also from the first." She laughed at his gravity. "But nobody wants a little cheat." "It is true, yet everybody wants a little princess." "But I'm not." "But you are." "Oh, you're wasting such a lot of time," she declared. "I just know you're ashamed of the way you're treating Princess Thurvinia. I know that deep in your heart of hearts your sense of duty to your country cries out as love could never cry, that you know you must go, and you wish to go and take the princess with you as your bride. I shouldn't like you in the least if you were any other way, and you want me to like you a little." "Oh, God of love," he answered, as only a tragic youth may answer. "But surely you can like me a little for myself?" She was very much in earnest. "Not a particle if you abandon your affianced princess, your distracted kingdom, or the nobler self I wish so much to admire." "But I love you," he protested. "Is that nothing?" "No," she laughed. "It's a nuisance to everyone but me. But the love of a man who deserts his country and his honour, oh, His sense of shame, only a little narcoticized by the brilliance and appeal of her beauty, struggled in his heart. "But, Princess, I am helpless," he declared. "What can I do?" "Shake hands and say good bye," she answered readily. "Promise you'll make your genuine princess happy, and serve your land, and let me call the Baron here and tell him how greatly I admire you." "The Baron?" he echoed. "He is not here." "Of course," said Thurley. "I wrote him to come. I'll ask him now." Her sentence was never completed. A glare of blinding light that penetrated the window's thickest curtains flashed from without in the snow-bound park, a terrifying detonation, shattering glass and rocking the house, instantly followed with a jar and a shock as if some world disaster. Shrieks and screams from the avenue, someone's cry within the building, and a heterogeneous medley of alarms arose on the second of lull that followed the thud and impact of the explosion. Then the door was flung open, and Alice was there, wild-eyed and gasping, horrified by the dreadful things she had fully expected to discover in the room where Thurley had been left. "Dearie!" she cried. "Oh, thank God! I thought—" "Carl!" cried a voice of the Baron at his heels, and he ran in after Alice, as certain as she that here in this room a dynamite bomb had been fired. "What was it?" cried Thurley, abruptly possessed of a dread that seemed to cast her back to her recent frights and perils. "What has happened?" "Oh, I thought I should die before I could reach the door," said Alice, pale and fearfully shaken. "It must have been out in the street." The Baron had hastened at once to the window. Wank had been instantly ordered outside to see what might be done. "Ah, in the park," said Hotchhouse, enormously relieved, and the others hastened to see. A crowd had gathered in the street below with promptness truly amazing. A swarming, excited mass of beings it was, with men swiftly running from all directions, and cabs, automobiles, and buses congregating in the dark, congested throng. It was all half lighted only by the street lamps gleaming through the trees. In the snow of the park the Congress had its centre, and Wank, escaping from the turgid eddy of beings, came hastening back to report. "Pelivan," he said to his chief at once, and Thurley nearly sank where she stood. Some way the creature, with a gas pipe engine of death and destruction in his hand, had exploded his horrible implement prematurely, there at the wall of the frozen park, on his way to cross the avenue and enter Alice's basement. The Duke was grey as ashes. "My God, what I should bring on this house!" he said, and Thurley, dimly hearing, understood. They were spared a detailed account of the mangled form across the crowded thoroughfare, but of fright they could not be relieved. The Baron, the Duke, and Wank at length departed. Carl Wilhelm matured in his manhood and resolution suddenly by the shock to his nerves and his heart. He took the time for one long look of gravity into Thurley's eyes, while her fearless gaze met his own. "You have already taught me my duty, believe me," he said, his face strangely hardened at that of a man. "I trust I shall always merit a little of your admiration, Princess Thurley." He raised his hand to his lips, kissed it reverently, and retreated backward from the room. Late that night, when Thurley looked down on the avenue and park, at last once more deserted, only a great gaping orifice, where snow and earth and rock had been, marked the spot of Pelivan's last venture. Then Alice came in, still white and quaking, dressed for retiring, but too disturbed for bed. Dear child," she said as she came and took her princess in her arms. "No more of my innocent game. I release you from every single promise." Thurley looked at her unwinkingly, afraid it meant that The game being done, she was due to be dismissed and return hence she had come. "No more?" she said. You won't need me any longer?" "For heaven's sake, dearie, what do you mean?" demanded Alice, equally disturbed. "Need you? I never needed any one so much in all my life. I simply intended to release you from all the foolish agreements I exacted. I realize the dangers I have plunged you in. I realize how selfish I should be, after all you've undergone, to deny you the slightest speck of happiness. That's all. If you wish to marry Acton Gaylord—" "Alice!" cried Thurley, all but ready to laugh, despite the tragic outcome of the evening. "Marry Acton Gaylord? Well, you lent him your money, and—" "Oh, I'll get it all back and return it to you gladly," interrupted Thurley, who had troubled her mind without respite over all the things she'd done. "I didn't realize it was not really mine to give. I wanted him to beat the Count, and he did. I acted impulsively, of course, I know, but I'll surely restore every cent I used in—" "Thurley Ruxton, what are you talking about, you silly little thing?" demanded Alice, unable to let her continue further. "That money was just as much yours as the hair on your head. You ought to be spanked to treat me so." But with tears in her eyes she clasped the girl against her breast and strained her there with all her strength. "You know that I love you. You know I approve of every single thing you've done at last. If you wish to marry Mr. Gaylord, I know that some way he must be splendid." "But I don't," objected Thurley. "I don't see why you ever thought I could." Alice pushed herself away and looked her squarely in the eyes. "I'm a kitten under 9 days old," she said. "Maybe you'd rather not marry any one at all." Thurley suddenly crimsoned, but the light in her eyes increased. "I admit it would have been awfully sweet to let Robley ask me, riding that morning in the snow," she said, "but I wanted to keep the promise made to you." Alice's eyes were abruptly brimming. "You poor, dear, darling little girl," she said, attempting to laugh, but achieving something nearer to a sob. "Let me call him up on the phone." End of chapter 48. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley Ruxton by Verrill MIGHELS. Chapter 49. A Trysting Place. The telephone was not disturbed that night. A mere metal wire has frequently warmed and tingled at the voice of Cupid speeding down its length, but Thurley had plans that were all her own, as well as a number of things to say that took no account of instruments that rendered distance between the principals obligatory. Some time late that Friday night, Gothem weather changed. A warm wind, drifting a tropical temperature from Tampa to the bleakness of New England, wrapped all the world of Manhattan in its voluptuous embrace and melted the snow from its bosom. The morning broke with crystal clearness, the sun all gold in a turquoise sky, and the summery breeze now languidly puffing at eddying pools of melted snow till they withered and floated away. The only mar in all the perfect morning was supplied by the city newspapers. Their accounts of the end of the miserable Pelivan, almost unanimously pronounced a Black Hand agent whose plot had judiciously miscarried, served to reawaken fears already sufficiently sleepless. But youth is retentive of joys and hopes where alarms find but temporary lodgment. Thurley was young, and her heart was too full of her own excitement to permit large room for dreads. She passed the morning in a constant succession of fevers and doubts, concerned alone with Robley Stuyvesant. But leaning on Alice for assistance was enormously sustaining, for Alice certainly helped. It was she who telephoned at last to Stuyvesant when the psychological moment had arrived. That was at 2 in the afternoon. "Just called you up to relieve your mind and set a misconception straight," she told him cheerily. "That loan, you know, of 30,000 to a certain individual. It was the prettiest two-edged stroke I've seen for an age. Yes, it floored a certain count and paralyzed its recipient like 1,000,000 volts coming from a hairpin. No, I'll tell you all about it later. Why, I'm trying to inform you delicately. She did it because she wanted to squelch them both. Yes, I thought perhaps you'd like to know where to find her." "No, she isn't here." "I don't know exactly where she is myself. Now, listen intently. She said she was going over in the park to some wonderfully romantic spot where someone broke his wrist one day, but for what earthly reason is more than a mortal could guess. Now wait, don't hurry. Robley." But there was silence on the wire. Thurley, at a little past the hour of 2, was seated alone on that particular bench she had one day occupied when all the world, though clothed in the splendours of its autumn gold and crimson, was a grey and desolate perspective so far as she could discern its wide expanse. To-day the sun obliquely slanted on denuded trees and on grass down-beaten and sodden from the recent snow, as well as on roads that here, in the sections of the park unfavoured by the pomp and glory of wealth, were practically deserted. Yet gleams of the world's most refulgent light seemed beckoning on all her far horizon, and though she still had doubts and tremors interspersed with all her hopes, the prospect seemed a verdant field of flowers and rills and song. A plump grey squirrel, bright-eyed, cosy in his furs, and confident of friendship from the whole human tribe, came inquiringly up to halt at Thurley's feet and beg for alms to crack. He tucked first one, then the other of his tiny paws in the muff of his little breasts, gazing at her appealingly and flirting the banner of his tail. "Hullo," said Thurley, "if I'd only thought to bring a bag of peanuts." Her hungry little visitor leaped upon the bench, came fearlessly up to walk across her lap, poke his active little nose against the glove on her hand, then leaped again to the earth and weather-trampled sod, where he took up a search for hidden treasures. Thurley had turned to watch him when the faint distant purring of a motor car spun her about on the seat. Stuyvesant came round the bend, holding the wheel as best he might, with a wrist still unequal to the task. The colour leaped to Thurley's cheeks like rose leaves tossed upward in a zephyr. Then the car was halted, and Stuyvesant rose to leap out over his extra tires, as he had done on the first occasion. "Oh, don't try that!" cried Thurley, her old impulsive self immediately uppermost as she sprang to her feet and ran a little toward the car. "Please don't break anything more." He laughed despite the depth of emotions in his breast, alighting quite intact. She stood in the road to meet him, and gave him her hand as he came there, doffing his cap. "You know I don't like threes exactly," she added, "if it means 3 injuries or anything like that." "I wonder if you'll ever meet me here again," he answered, as they turned to go to her bench. "That's the sort of threes I hope for, the threes with nothing but charms. But they might not be that kind after all," she faltered, resuming the seat she had occupied. "It's so easy these days for folks to be deceived, to deceive themselves and everything. He sat beside her and leaned a little forward. His face was inclined to paleness again. His eyes were intensely serious. "I think I have deceived myself for the final time, concerning some few things at least," he said, referring to his errors of judgment respecting Gaylord and her loan. "I hope to-day may render possible some final understandings." His earnestness a little disconcerted the happiness of spirit she had instantly conceived at his coming. She could only infer that he had come upon truths he found not altogether pleasant. "I have never wished to deceive you for a moment," she said. "I made up my mind to tell you everything, absolutely everything, to-day." It was Stuyvesant's turn to be surprised and puzzled. "Everything? You mean about your duties to Hertsegotha? Wait, please, before you answer. This may be perhaps our final little talk together, our last sunbright experience after the fates had seemed. I only wish to say that on the morning when we drove together through the snow, I spoke unguardedly. The stress of the moment, everything conspired to wring that declaration from my lips, and yet her heart was sinking. You didn't mean it." She tried to smile as the sunlight seemed about to vanish. "I have come here to confess and sue for pardon together," he told her, holding her gaze to his own with ties grown sacred and irresistible. "I love you, Princess, despite my utmost wish and sense of the hopeless plight into which I am plunged. I shall love you always, even though I have no right, even although you bid it cease for its haunting echo in your after years. I would give my life to serve you. I would almost give it for this moment here, ours, all ours, so long as it may last. And if you find this quite beyond your pardon, nevertheless my love shall live, for none save God could make it die. And yet I hope for your pardon." She had closed her eyes and leaned a little back in the sweetness and marvellous ecstasy. She had no power at the moment to deny her heart, which had yearned and ached for his words. After a moment of silence and intensity, he added, "I'm not to be forgiven?" "Oh, don't say that," she begged him suddenly. "It is I who must beg forgiveness. But I came to tell you all, every little thing, that I am not a princess, that I am nothing in the world but just—" "Not a princess?" he interrupted suddenly, catching at her hand, which he held with a pressure that hurt and crushed, yet sent mad gladness to her heart. "Not Princess Thurvinia, not—" "Oh, no, no, no," she cried, "but I never claimed I was. Alice never claimed it. We just let the rumour go. I don't know why we did it. We never realised what dreadful things might happen, what serious consequences." Thoroughly, thank God," he broke in, wildly joyous, unspeakably relieved. "I have a right to love you then, to love you and love you and love you." She suddenly sprang to her feet to avoid the madness of his wooing. "But wait," she cried, "I've got to tell you all. I am no one in the world. I don't belong in your social sphere. I'm only what Alice has made me. Now you can take it all back if you like." She had never been braver, never more beautiful, honest, splendid in all her changeful career. She faced him frankly, her wonderful courage and candour shining in her eyes with a light of love she feared at that moment must be for ever hopeless. "Little heart," he said, his utterance singularly soft and charged with tenderness, "you are my little princess, my glorious little queen. You are what the gods have made you, my Thurley, the noblest, sweetest little woman in the world." She sank on the bench weakly, her eyes abruptly filled. "Oh, Robbie, don't say it, please," she begged, "if you ever want to take it back again." He sank on his knees, despite all sense of time and place, and kissed her hand. "Comrade," he said, beloved. He drove the car when at last they knew they must return to her avenue home. They were alone at last in the room where so many emotions had run their course. She came to him simply, such a wealth of love overbrimming her eyes that Robley's senses lifted away from all the things of earth. He held her passionately in his arms, while her own arms stole about his neck. Then they took and gave that wondrous kiss of glory. End of chapter 49. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley Ruxton by Verrill MIGHELS. Chapter 50. Princess Thurley. The social triumph of Alice Van Kirk was in no wise diminished when at length the truth concerning Princess Thurvinia was known throughout the length and breadth of Swelldom. Thurley had gained rather than lost admiring hosts, and the natural interest excited was increased. The dinner that Alice had long planned was the season's social masterpiece. The holidays were spent away from town, where Robley and Thurley, like two young striplings from the Pantheon before the pagan gods and goddesses had lost their pristine charm, found new delights and new relations with the earth and stars in the wonder of their love. A brilliant procession of social events marched through the weeks as they sped. The recent past, with its doubts and fears, its excitements, intrigues, and startling evolutions, was gliding away on the placid sea of memory, when one more echo rolled across from far Herzegovina, where the young Grand Duke, with a bride resembling Thurley Ruxton, had succeeded to the throne. It came in the name of their Majesties, but bore the signature of Baron von Hochhaus, whose personal letter was attached. In recognition of invaluable services to Princess Thurvinia, to the Kingdom of Herzegovina, and to Karl Wilhelm Hermann, King by the grace of God, and in the name and with the love of an appreciative and perpetually grateful people, was the reading of the part of the message which described a modest but glorious girl as defender of Her Majesty the Queen, and a princess by special appointment of heaven. It was a triple recognition. There was first the scroll, a gold-laid, massive, impressive document denoting the extraordinary service rendered, then in partial liquidation of the state's indebtedness, a gift of $250,000, and finally a medal and full decoration of the Royal Legion of Courage. But the last little contribution, which succeeded in quite overwhelming the heart of the princess by appointment of heaven, was the merest unofficial scrawl from the big proportioned little baron. I trust the love of an old man, fond in his own poor personal capacity, may likewise be accepted. There was much that was golden and marvellously sweet to gaze back upon and wonder, as Thurley and Robley, at the stern of a great Atlantic liner, watched all America, green with coming spring, dip slowly down in the purple sea and disappear behind the earth's rotundity. There was much that was splendid and dream-fulfilling for them both to contemplate, far out to the east, where an older world would rise from the sea above the rounded bulk of ocean. But most of all, and greater than all, was the world of limitless space and inexpressible splendour that the two beheld when they looked again in each other's eyes. A honeymoon day from the trophies, spiced with the fragrances of far-off Yucatan, was wafting lazily by.
Thurley smiled as she gazed at the sun splash in the water. "Is it too soon yet," she said, "to ask where I am going to be taken?" To motor through Egypt first," he answered happily, "then all about the continent, and perhaps to Herzegovina." She clung to his arm and leaned upon his shoulder, closing her eyes on the sheer delight she had no words to express. Like the prince in the tale, he leaned in rapture and kissed her on the lips. But to all the world of love and ecstasy, the princess was already wide awake. The end of Thurley Ruxton by Philip Verrill MIGHELS, read by Paul Hansen.